Barbara, I'm not sure where you're going to sit. Hey, Rudy. Barbara needs a chair. I mean, she has a chair, but it's not one she can sit in. Oh, Shannon. Barbara, you owe Shannon one.
I know I do.
So, Rudy, the chair is now for Shannon.
At the back.
Okay, well, let me welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone here on a Friday afternoon, a beautiful day. I realize there's all kinds of things you could be doing. Most importantly, back in the laboratory, working until 9, 10 o'clock this evening. But we're glad that you are here for this seminar. It's very special to have Dr. Jay Vacanti here. Jay and I have been around the block several times. He was a keynote speaker at our first Hilton Head workshop in 1997. And we've been remiss to not get him back since then. Jay Vacanti, originally from Nebraska, undergraduate, Creighton University, medical school, University of Nebraska. Somehow he made his way to Harvard. And I guess to some extent your life hasn't been the same since then.
It's fair.
Obviously very accomplished. He's professor of surgery at Harvard, Massachusetts General Hospital. He, a few years ago, was elected to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. But in the world of tissue engineering, I guess what I would say about Jay Vacanti is he's bigger than life. He was there pioneering it at a time when a lot of people were poo-pooing what this was all going to be. He continues to do great work, and I think it's wonderful to have him here, and as he indicates in his title, to provide a surgeon's perspective. So, Jay, I don't want to take any more of your time. Welcome to Georgia Tech, to Atlanta, and to our Georgia Tech Emory Center.
Thank you very much, Bob. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Bob said it right. We've been friends for a very long time, and I'm now delighted to have been invited down here and have the opportunity to not only see the facility, but also to have a chance to meet, hopefully, many of you and learn exactly what's going on here. Now, I'm a little unusual for this campus because I am a clinical surgeon, and from the beginning, that's sort of how I became involved. So I put this talk together mostly with the students in mind and with that in mind. And Bob also said it right. It's a beautiful day out. I should have you out of here by 10. And the other funny...
Your seminars do not have to be as long as your surgery.
Well, some of those start short and they end long, but I promise you that won't happen today. So what I'll do is take you through this more as a personal journey, and then I'm sure we'll have time for questions after I give the talk. So let's see how we do with this thing. So I don't really want to stand in front of the podium, so we'll see what we can do. So as I actually came to the Massachusetts General Hospital as a surgical intern in 1974. That's 31 years ago. And there's a culture at the MGH, but it's a little different than this. This is a very good hospital. And in every very good hospital in the country, occasionally there is a patient who has a terrible problem. And in a very good place, the answer is, I am sorry, but there's nothing more that we can do. And that's perfectly good in a very good hospital. But when you're in an academic center, then somebody could say, I have an idea that might help with this bad problem. So in that circumstance, you need to be in a very special place. So a place like I am, like Emory, so clinical people who want to go beyond this to this, this is a common route to have that happen. And we're very lucky, as you are here, because if we start with the terrible clinical problem, then we can draw upon our resources and our friends. And in the case of Mass General, which is part of Harvard, we can draw on MIT, the Draper Laboratories, this entity that was started at the General almost 8 years ago called the Center for the Integration of Medicine and Innovative Technologies. But all of these organizations create young, interested people like you that can come together to get back to this terrible problem. Now, a spin-off is, like Dr. Niram, you can become a professor, starting with the problem. You can write grants, get them, you can build buildings, write papers, give lectures, but that really isn't the central element of what we're doing. The central element is this. Therefore, to complete the loop, all of this should result in this, which gets back to the patient. So again, from a doctor's point of view, the loop is very important to return to, and in that loop is the obligatory involvement of industry. Because if you go into any hospital, any bed space, any ICU, any operating room, every tool we use to take care of a patient has gone through this route. So we as academics cannot complete the loop alone. And that's a very important concept. I think as we evolve how we're going to solve the problem, we should always have in mind that the solution ought to be a practical solution and that somebody should become interested in it so that they can have their shareholders make money for the purposes of getting this back to the patient. That's not a bad thing. There are places where that's perceived as bad. Harvard is one of those places. So there has to be a cultural shift because we want to get back to the patient. And I think that it's a very important thing. So this is the paradigm into which my work in tissue engineering began and has evolved. So what does that mean in practical terms for me? Well, this is the kind of patient, and this is one of my patients, that I became interested in. This little girl has a progressive disease that she was born with that destroys first her bile ducts, then her liver, and then kills her. And before about the mid-1970s, roughly 90% of kids born with this particular problem died. So there weren't any medicines and there weren't any operations before the mid-70s that were successful. And so we would say, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. But by the mid-1970s, there were some surgical techniques that evolved. And I became involved as a young surgeon with, if the reconstructive operation failed, then we were able to remove the diseased organ, the liver, and replace it with somebody else's liver, and that's an organ transplant. And here I am in almost exactly this date in 1984. It was Patriots' Day. So these urgent, terrible operations always occur on a holiday or a personal important day or a Christian holiday, because I'm Christian. So this occurred on Patriots' Day, which is the day that we have the Boston Marathon, but it's actually the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. It's a very important day in New England. So here we were in 1984 doing the first successful liver transplant in a child in New England. And as a young surgeon, that was a fairly stressful circumstance to be doing the first. And there were a few times, it's a very complex operation, where we were a little bit not certain of where we were and what we were doing. But the radio kept saying we were doing great. We had the radio on, and they said we were doing great, so that gave us confidence. In any event, that operation in 1984 was successful, It was an infant, a 15-month-old child with the disease I showed you. There was a fair amount of press. And here he is 20 years later. So again, I show you this because, again, from a clinician's perspective, the thing that drives us is the potential for success. So many people ask me, how can you take care of these terribly ill patients? Isn't it depressing? And the answer is it would be depressing if we were never successful. But the truth is we are. And this is an example of turning a disease with a 90% fatality into a success of about 90% at 10 years using the tools that we have today. So it's a very good thing. And you can see here that he's healthy and happy. In fact, he's married and is doing quite well. There's another little girl who was similar to the first little child I showed you. Here she is several years after her transplant as a newborn. But this is what she looked like. And again, I show you these pictures not to shock you, but to have you understand from a clinician's perspective why you're driven to try to find new solutions. So this girl is this girl. And when we were taking care of her, again, remember, it's just one tissue that isn't working right, but it's a vital tissue, the liver. And in any vital organ failure, especially in kids, they can do very well and compensate with enormous reserve until about 90% of that organ's function has failed. And the final 10% is a horror beyond belief. So we put her on a waiting list as soon as we knew she had the problem, and she waited and waited and waited. And I took this photograph when she was still an outpatient living with her family. We were doing everything we could to support her nutrition. But again, since it's a vital organ, all the systems begin to fail. And you can see that clearly here. We ended up finding an organ for her from the West Coast because she was in an intensive care unit on life support, and that finally got us high enough on the list that we were able to get her an organ. So again, putting my clinical hat on, I'll just quickly take you through this. So now I've been involved with this one kind of patient care, one kind of surgery now for about 20 years. And transplantation, I'm very proud to say, began in the Harvard hospitals. This is a painting that now hangs in the Countway Library that demonstrates the world's first successful human transplant, which was done at the Brigham Hospital in 1954. And this is Dr. Murray, who's one of my teachers, transplanting a kidney from a twin brother who was being operated on here, an identical twin, so genetically identical, his kidney, one of his kidneys, into his dying brother, and that was successful. And from a chief's point of view, Bob, there's something very interesting here. He was a young surgeon who did all the research to lead to this operation, and the chairman or the chief is carrying the organ from one room to the other. That's Dr. Francis Moore. So when you become senior enough to become a chief, part of the recruitment is to find somebody who's extraordinarily generous and who can take pride in the students that he's training. And certainly Dr. Moore exemplifies that here, and I think that that's a wonderful depiction of how it really happened. And as many of you may know, Dr. Murray went on to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1990 for his contributions in transplantation. Okay, again, here's the operating room. This is a bad liver, okay? This is end stage, right before we're taking it out. Here's a good liver. You can see the ice here. And again, one tissue set of functions. And so we need to replace enough of that tissue. In this circumstance, it's the entire organ, and it must work immediately. And here it is after we've implanted it. And we've actually, as you know, sewn in the blood vessels so that we release the clamps. There's immediate perfusion of oxygenated blood throughout the organ so that there can be immediate function. This was actually the first Canadian child that had a successful liver transplant. This was 1985. And I show this slide to give you all a sense of just how difficult it is to not only get through the surgery, but to take care of the patients. And every monitor that's been invented is brought to the bedside. This little bag actually monitors bile output. And then these are drains, because it's a big operation and there can be a lot of bleeding, not only during the operation, but after the operation. And again, this photograph was taken in 1985. The surprise is it's not much different in the year 2005. Here he is after the surgery. Here he is at his first communion. Here he is playing hockey. And here he is with his little brother. So again, the success is what drives us to seek solutions in which there are currently no good solutions. This little guy was sent up from New York, and you see here a bag, and this bag was trying to drain bile from a previous reconstructive operation. It did not work, and this baby was dying. And in order to get him an organ, we did something that we had never done before, which is, it was a mortal sin in this era, I can say that because the Pope has died. You cannot cross blood groups. So we all are either an A, a B, or an O. And there are certain combinations which will work, but other combinations which will absolutely be recognized by your body, and you'll have an intense acute reaction. Well, we crossed blood groups in this child. He was in blood group A, and we put a blood group B liver into him because we had a little insight into the biology and the antibodies that circulate in our bloodstream against the other blood types actually evolve over time. And so we had measured the antibodies in this child, and we now know that age 2 and under, you can actually do this safely with the strategy of what we call plasmapheresis. So in any event, he was our first. This was about 1987, and here he is. And so again, another example of persistence, creativity with the tools we have. What can we do? And as you know, the organ shortage has been an ongoing issue that I'll get to, but a surgical solution is the following: that anatomically, the liver has discrete anatomic units that contain a complete blood supply and a complete biliary tract. So that if we're very careful in delineating these and dissecting these, we can actually take a piece of a bigger liver and put it into a smaller patient. And that was the first step with towards solving the organ shortage creatively. So then one could imagine that not only could you take one piece and not throw away the rest, but divide it in such a way that part could go into a bigger patient and the smaller part could go into a smaller patient. And that's called split liver transplantation. And here's an example of a piece. This is the smallest piece that you can do anatomically. It's called the left lateral segment. And you can see all the various connections here. Here's the portal vein, all the blood from the intestine going to the liver, and the outflow of the hepatic vein back up to the heart. Here's the arterial inflow, and here's the bile duct output. This is a little baby in the newborn period. You can see the big incision here. This is the opposite of minimally invasive surgery. This is maximally invasive surgery. But maybe someday with tissue engineering, we can turn it into minimally invasive. Here's that piece of liver after we've individually stitched the raw surface where we've cut through the liver. And here's that child some many years after that first operation. This little girl was the first one on the East Coast that got a piece of liver from a living donor. In this case, it was her father, and this was 1992. And here she is after that operation, and here she is more recently. And I'll tell you one last sort of anecdotal story from the operating room before we get into the science. So this is a newborn baby, and you can see he's very sick. And he was sent up from Hasbro Children's in Rhode Island with his heart not working, his lungs not working, his kidneys not working, and his liver not working. His brain seemed to work and his intestine nobody knew, okay? So he was sent up because we have a machine at our children's hospital at Mass General. It's called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And it's a form of cardiopulmonary support. But for newborns, you can actually totally support the heart and lungs in the ICU for up to a month. So we put him on that machine for 3 weeks. And during that 3-week interval, his heart returned function, his lungs returned function, his kidneys returned function, but his liver remained dead. So at that period of time, we entertained with the family the possibility of doing a transplant. To make a very long story short, there had been no previous case of this that had been reported or that anybody knew of. So we generously quoted about a 20% chance of success to the family. We ended up doing what is termed a split liver transplant. And here you can sort of see it, where we're dividing the liver almost down the middle, and this piece, the smaller piece, went into that child, and here he is some 2 years later. So the part of me that Bob doesn't see talked about very well or often is the clinical piece, which is really what has driven our work that I'll now go through. So to summarize just this one kind of patient care, liver transplantation in children, the bottom line is now after 20 years, 2/3 of all of those kids are still alive, and virtually all of those kids that are alive are well. So again, the success, the hint of success, drives us to make it better. And this is the problem that has driven us in all of our work in tissue engineering. This is 4 years after we began our work in tissue engineering, and the organ shortage was described as awful and acute. 19,000 patients in the United States. Now, all these years later, it's up to 88,000. So the drive to actually get this done, complete the loop, and solve the organ shortage is really very, very pressing. Now, at least our work didn't, I'm sure here you have an idea and it's a straight line to home base. That isn't really how our work evolved. And in fact, when we began, this picture is from 1985, and this is a mouse. And this clamp is on the liver after removing part of the liver, but we weren't removing it to grow the liver cells to grow a new liver. The first idea that I had was when you cut across the liver, you can imagine all those bile ducts and all those blood vessels oozing. And that was a big problem, especially in 1985. So I thought, one of my very closest friends is Professor Robert Langer. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if you could paint on a plastic, have it harden instantly, and then be like plexiglass here and seal this raw surface? So I went to Bob and I said, do you have any stuff like this? And could it go away? Could it be temporary and go away so that we'd end up with a healed surface with no foreign body so it wouldn't get infected? And he said, sure, we can do that. And he assigned one of his postdoctoral fellows to the project, Avi Dom, who's now in Israel. And he worked up a few concoctions. From my point of view, it was a few concoctions. And so I would paint these things on, they would dry, and then we'd let it heal, and I'd look at it under the microscope. And this actually was very successful, and there was very good healing, minimal inflammation. But as I looked at hundreds of these sections, it occurred to me that the liver cells looked so healthy that maybe we could use these polymers as a delivery pallet to deliver hepatocytes back, a form of cell transplantation. So really, that first inclination to produce something to deliver hepatocytes really was trying to solve the problem in an incremental way using liver resection. And as people know, that turned out to be a pretty successful approach, so much so that we never wrote up that last set of studies. It remains. So if anybody here is interested in writing up a nice little paper on how to heal the liver using polymers, there is some preliminary work. And it's now about 20 years old. So this is one of the first wafers that we designed. It's about the size of a dime, And this is made out of a degradable polyanhydride. And we load this with hepatocytes and then implant it in the omentum. But what's interesting is this is not a foam. It's not a fiber-based material. I'll get to that. But when I look back at all this, this little branching structure was not there to increase surface area, but it was actually there to try to cue the hepatocytes to begin to form bile ducts. So even as early as 1985-86, we were trying to think through how to start signaling those cells to do what we'd like them to do, to not only put a little lump of liver there, but try to form bile ducts. And again, as probably everybody in this room knows, the central issue in terms of design of the systems, if what you want is a big enough piece of tissue, is this fundamental problem, that as the mass of cells is larger and larger, the surface area where the exchange of oxygen and nutrition occurs only increases as the square of the radius, but the volume of cells that needs the mass transfer increases as the cube. So every design in the field of tissue engineering must try to match the surface area to volume for effective mass transfer. There are a number of strategies to try to do it, but you can't avoid this. So whether you start with 2 stem cells and have them grow a mass of tissue and grow the blood vessels as they grow the mass of tissue, or whether you try to implant a very large structure, you have to deal with this problem. And our solution in 1986 was really based on nature's solution for multicellular systems, which is the volume is broken up through these fractal-based branching systems. And that way you have an effective increase in surface area as the volume increases. So based on this, and this you see is a vascular cast of a human lung demonstrating that this is nature's solution through all systems that are multicellular in the plant world, the animal world, the human world, and in fact all communication between all systems is through these fractal branching patterns. So this is from 1986, and it's a little graft of hepatocytes. And when we started doing this, we actually had very early success. And in fact, even in these early grafts, you can see an hepatocyte undergoing mitosis here and another one here in the very earliest beginnings of a biliary system. This is from 1986, and it's a little cyst that started as little minced pieces of fetal intestine, and again, showing success very early on. So our first paper was actually in my specialty in pediatric surgery, and this led to then our general approach, myself with Professor Langer, with combining these synthetic degradable systems that were suitably configured for mass transfer with the appropriate cell type, implantation, vascular ingrowth or angiogenesis, and then formation of a permanent tissue. If we were really good at it, we got good tissue. If we were bad at it, we got scar tissue. So the trick to get all this became, how do you do this in the best possible way using all the tools of tissue engineering? And again, just for the historical record for all of the young people, whenever you start down a new road, you're not universally embraced. And so this is roughly 10 years into our work. Eugene Bell, who's really one of the pioneers of the field, and he wrote this in this journal. I think it's fatuous to think that one can take a plastic material off the shelf and so on and so forth. So when I saw that he had actually acknowledged us, and being a kid from Nebraska, I called my wife and I said, gee, Dr. Bell has acknowledged us in this paper. But I couldn't really remember what fatuous meant, so I looked it up. And fatuous means complacently or inanely foolish or stupid. So then I said, oh, I hope he's not one of our grant reviewers. And through the years, it turned out that not only was he a reviewer, but a lot of his friends were. So as a young person, the more riskier the road you take, don't count on everybody embracing your work, but you must be persistent, passionate, and you must have chiefs or chairmen that will protect you and support you. So I'll quickly very much go through a lot of the evolution in our laboratories. My brother Charles, who's now chief of anesthesia at the Brigham Hospital, began the work in the lab with bone and cartilage. And here you see one of our early polymer structures, and the clinicians in the audience would recognize that these actually were not built at MIT, and they really weren't expensive because we stole them from the operating room. And this is just unfrayed suture material made of polyglycolic acid. This particular material is called Dexon. So we were able to raid the operating room as long as it was the middle of the night, and then we would fashion these, add the cells, and implant these into small animals. And here you see the progression over time of cartilage formation. As the polymer disappears, new cartilage is formed. And you all are aware of this. From early to late in culture, you can drive it all the way to complete tissue. And then the clinical perspective. This child has been born with terrible cranial facial anomalies, some of which are life-threatening, other of which are disfiguring. But even if it's only disfiguring, as this ear would be, you can imagine that it would produce such terrible psychosocial implications for not only the child but the family, that any improvement that we can do with these terrible anomalies would be a great advance for the field of plastic craniofacial surgery. So again, by 1989, we were experimenting with this with the cartilage that I had shown you previously. And here's an animal that has been reconfigured in sort of a Klingon way. And here's the new cartilage that was formed. And we learned by 1989 that we could make very specific shapes, add the appropriate number of cells, implant them, and then the shape would be well maintained. And this famous or infamous mouse is a demonstration of that with human cells in human shape of an ear. It's a human ear on the back of a mouse. And it became a relative icon. I thought it would be a terrible thing to have this come out in the lay press. My brother thought otherwise, and it turns out I think the net effect has been good because it increased lay awareness that this field was emerging. But when this was originally presented in 1994 at the American College of Surgeons, Jurassic Park had just come out. So we called him Auriculosaurus. And here's the cartilage that has been formed. There was a reasonable amount of press. Here you see nasal cartilages, cells on polymers. Here by 1996, we are making composites of bone, joint space in between with good, this is about 6 months after implantation on the back of a mouse, and you can see good bone, joint space, and good histology. So where are we going with that? Well, there is this technology called a three-dimensional printer that you all probably know more about than I do, but it's very cool and is very germane to the work. So this skull started as a three-dimensional CT scan of a real human, and it's been converted to digital data and then converted through this machine layer by layer to make this skull. And you can imagine then if you use a degradable polymer, make it suitably porous with the right mechanical characteristics, if you took a sample of the patient's own bone marrow, enriched it for the stem cells, signaled them to turn to bone, you could do a complete surgical reconstruction of the cranial facial skeleton as a one-step definitive reconstruction. So that's the road we're going down in pigs. Cardiovascular, I'm really going to skip through because it's like bringing coals to Newcastle. But as people here know, the first now vascular implants are in patients in Japan from one of our former fellows who's a congenital heart surgeon at Tokyo Women's Hospital. And he's now done over 50 children with either pulmonary artery segments or vena cava segments with success. As a pediatric surgeon, I also take care of this kind of baby. He's born with an abdominal wall defect, but then his intestine continues to float in amniotic fluid and is injured. And some of these kids have what we call short gut syndrome, and the gut is a vital organ. So could you make intestine? We were making it by the late 1980s. Here's one of those early photographs. Here is Rosa Choi's work with normal rat intestine here, tissue engineered intestine here, and here's more recent work from Tracy Grickscheit comparing normal rat to engineered that's been sewn back into the main intestinal lumen and now showing benefit to the animals after a massive small bowel resection. My field of congenital anomaly surgery, children are born with a defect in their esophagus. It's called esophageal atresia. This was 100% fatal before the 1930s for lack of a simple tube, but it was an important tube. It's the food tube. And there are some that are called long gap atresia with very long distances between the top and the bottom. This little guy presented with that, and here he is after a surgical reconstruction some 20 years later. But now, we now have tissue engineered esophagus, and this again is some of Tracy's work demonstrating engineered esophagus compared to native esophagus. So I'm going to end this talk with the same organ that I began with, the liver. So the vital organs continue to be an enormous challenge, not only for our groups in Boston, but worldwide. It's a terrible problem, as I've demonstrated. And based on all the work that we've done and others have done, we've sort of boiled it down to the following simple analysis. Why can't we do it yet? The answer is, our answer is, we can't do it yet because we can't deliver enough mass. You need a very big piece of liver to keep somebody alive and well. So what we've learned, all the tools of tissue engineering to date, we can get good tissue of any X dimension and any Y dimension, but the Z-axis, distance from a vascular bed, the best anybody's been able to do is about 1 centimeter. So for most tissues of the body, 1 centimeter is really not bad. It's perfectly fine. Even bone is a hollow tube. Not hollow, but it's a tube, and the dimension, the thickness of even thick femur is only about 1 centimeter. So you can do a lot with 1 centimeter. But that's not enough for liver, it's not enough for kidney or lung. So the question is, how do you solve that problem? So again, there are about 3 or 4 conceptual solutions. The solution we chose about 6 years ago, again, was very simplistic. It was, if you can't wait 3 to 5 days for blood vessels to grow, then build the blood vessels. If you can build the liver, why can't you build the blood vessels? So that's what we decided to do, and it turns out that it's a very simple conceptual solution. It is a very difficult engineering and science solution, but I'll take you through where we are and what we've done. So the first thing you need to do is understand the design, and then you have to figure out a way how to duplicate the design and then test it. So here's the design. This is a vascular cast of a human liver, and again, it looks fairly complicated, and it is, but it's based on fractal mathematics. So Roger Kam's group at MIT, Dr. Mohammad Kazimpour Mofid, has spent the last 6 years developing a very robust computational model of vascular network topology, rheology of blood flow through it, and then mass transfer across it. So once we have those designs, which we do, then we give those designs to our colleagues at Draper, specifically Jeff Borenstein, who runs MEMS fabrication, and then we translate these designs into MEMS-based systems and then add the living elements to them. So the MEMS is ideal because its scale is the same as the scale of a circulation and the endothelial lined circulation. So here's part of the vascular network, the capillaries. Here's a high sort of magnification of that. And here's one of our channels in a MEMS-based device compared to the same scale. This happens to be a MEMS guidance system because Draper spun out of MIT in the 70s during the Vietnam War, and has largely been a secret contract lab for the Department of Defense. So it's only within the last 6 years or so where healthcare has become an agenda item at Draper Labs. So translating this kind of technology into these sorts of solutions was the challenge. And here's the approach that we have taken. So it's silicon-based. You have a silicon wafer, but instead of an electrical circuit etched on it like a computer chip, we're etching a vascular circuit. And then we etch it in reverse so that we can pour a liquid polymer on it. The polymer dries, we peel it off the mold, and then we seal it, and then we stack it. So through a strategy of stacking like units with communication through the z-axis, if we can stack enough thin layers, then we should be able to duplicate a vascular circulation. And here's a degradable polymer-based single layer of channels. And here again demonstrates a later generation of a circuitry with the analytical solution based on what the capillaries look like. And here's our strategy for liver conceptually. So here you see the stack of the blood vessels, but in between is the parenchymal functional layer. You need to get in the liver and bile ducts. So this is the approach we've taken. Here's the vascular side. We have a semi-permeable membrane which dictates how much communication occurs between the vascular side and the liver biliary side. And then this bilayer component becomes the stackable unit. So that's what we've been working on over the last 6 years. This shows that it's not just surgeons playing in the laboratory, that in fact there's honest-to-God engineering going on. Here's microfluidic flow through this is a single channel, capillary channel, the smallest dimension in this fractal set of channels, and you can see the modeling of the viscous laminar flow through it. This is a polymer that has distensibility, so again, that can be modeled, as you all know, better than I do, and that factored in. So we make the models, we do the experiment, we compare our experimental data to the model, and it's an iterative process over time. And again, I won't go through all of this, mostly because I don't understand it myself, but this shows the differences of predicted and experimental with 2 different pressures in these distensible channels. This is the model of the distribution of pressure throughout, so that we design these things to be physiologic with shear stress, pressures, and flows, and then we test it. This is one of the later generation of systems, and it's very interesting. As we built these, we compare the orders of branching to normal human pulmonary vasculature, or in this case, right coronary artery of the pig, where you can actually go to the literature. And those designs started to fall off in terms of density as the units of tubes became smaller and smaller in the fractal order. So Mohammed went back to the computer and went from this sort of design to this sort of design, and was able to get the calculated distribution much closer in density to the normal situation. Instead of this, he ended up with this. Now, we haven't been able to build that yet, but we're building that now. And if that's the case and we make these thin enough, then we're almost to tissue density, not only for the vascular circulation, but also for the parenchymal side of it, the functional side of it. So where are we testing these devices? And again, our labs are surgical labs, so we can go to animal models. And from day one, 20 years now, we've never drifted from animals because we want to get back into humans. So we've always tested in animals. I'll show you first in vitro. So these are now these bilayer units with a semi-permeable membrane loaded on one side with human liver cell line, HepG2A, and on the other side is our vascular flow. And again, my fellows tell me, and again, they recognize I'm a surgeon, so they say it very slowly And very simply, they say, these are liver cells. Green is good. Green means they're alive. Red is bad. Red is dead. So after 10 days in these flow bioreactors, you see it's mostly green. Green is good. The cells are alive. But as importantly, not only are they alive, but they're still doing their housekeeping. So here you see production of ferritin over time, and per cell, this is about normal for that cell line. And potentially very importantly, if you drip a drug in on one side, this is ethoxycoumarin, and it's depicted here, the drug goes down over time, it's metabolized, but the human P450 metabolic products go up over time. So it isn't just degradation, it's actual drug metabolic activity of a human system in a flow bioreactor. So we feel that it may be important for the drug industry because, as you all know, you can make two terrible errors developing a drug. And for a drug company, either one is really expensive. So it costs about $800 million to get a drug to market. And most of that is up front before the first human trials. And 25% fail when they go into humans. So when they've been studied in animals and shown to not be toxic, then a human trial is designed. 25% show toxicity. A few escape that and then show toxicity late. It's all over the news now. So that's one bad error. But think about the other error. Let's say you have a new drug to cure cancer and it makes a rat sick. But if you gave it to a human, it wouldn't make him sick and it would help with the cancer. How many of those drugs are sitting on shelves because they made rats sick? So if there was a way to test this before it actually went into a human, let's say rat was sick, human hepatocytes didn't get sick, you might design some sort of a tie-breaking third to test it to see whether it's worth pursuing, just simply because it made the rat sick. So that's another non-quantifiable error that may be a very important error to try to correct. This is one of those things implanted in a rat. And this is actual femoral artery, blood flow through it, femoral vein, back to the heart. So we're implanting these in animals. We have documented flow and survival out to 10 days after implantation currently. So we're very encouraged that not only can we build these devices, but they actually will support blood flow and support cell survival in an intact animal. Now, I want to show you these movies because, again, cardiovascular tissue engineering is huge and important here, and this is pretty cool. So this is not a real capillary. This is a tissue-engineered capillary, but this is real blood flowing through it. And what you see, so this is a confocal system that actually counts red cells. So we actually have quantitative data that shows the blood in through, and here's the capillary, and then the outflow. But you can see here how nicely laminar this flow is. And the early results of our quantitation is that it actually matches the model in terms of all the physiologic characteristics. So to me, that's very exciting. So I'll end with where we are currently with this part of our research. This is a stack of those bilayer units. It's about a 35-layer stack. And you can see here vascular inflow, outflow, but also you can see on the other side, we can actually sample the hepatic and biliary side. Here's a side view. And I thought I'd show you this. So here you see that vascular cast I showed you earlier. And now we've injected a dye and taken a CT scan of our vascular network that's been stacked. So this is 35 layers in the dimensions you see. But then I'll show you this movie. So this is now a three-dimensional CT scan using what's called a volumetric CT that has a resolution down to 100 microns. So as it comes around, you'll be able to see the inflow here throughout here, and then you can see the even distribution of flow throughout the vascular elements, including all the capillaries throughout the device. So again, we're currently quantitating this and comparing it to the model, but from my point of view, this is now proof of principle that we can not only make these, but we can make them in significant amounts to get by the original problem we started with, which was dimensions. Make things as big as we need them to be. So currently, this probably is not completely accurate, but as of a year and a half ago now, there were about 6 structures that were either available for humans or in human trials. And I'll end with this quote from Alan Kay, Xerox PARC. And many of you may know the story that Xerox PARC in the early 70s, late 60s, was really the innovator of the personal computer. And that when Steve Jobs went and took his team after he had formed Apple, that's where he got the concept of the pull-down windows and also the mouse. It actually came out of Xerox PARC. And then when Bill Gates stole it from Steve Jobs couldn't fight it because he stole it from Xerox PARC. But Alan Kay was one of those people in Xerox PARC, and there's a book out called The Dealers of Lightning about this whole era. And what he said was the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So that's really the challenge for all of you young people. And I think the collaboration in the center here that Bob has created really allows your sorts of people to work with people like me so that we can complete the loop and actually make patients better. So with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
We'll open up for questions, but I'll just make one comment, Jay. Great talk, but it's interesting that, yes, Xerox PARC was the inventor, but they weren't able to commercialize it.
Exactly right.
So,
Because the people that ran Xerox Corporation thought that they were kids in a sandbox and it wasn't going to go anywhere. So they killed it. Is that a fair?
yeah.
That's how I. Yes.
Could you explain a little more about the spinal, the three-dimensional liver that you discussed? Are there only hepatocytes in that system, and the blood vessels are polymer exclusively, or are there cells in blood vessels?
Well, the answer is ultimately what we would like is a completely living structure. So we plan on having the vascular piece be completely living and the hepatobiliary piece be completely living. To date, the experiments have been limited. We have completely lined some of these with vascular endothelial cells. So we know we sort of have enough tricks that we can cobblestone them and have flow through them. We also know that we can put these human cell lines into the other side and have them plate, grow in 3 dimensions, and function as I've shown you. In the last month or so, we've been doing work with primary human hepatocytes and primary rat hepatocytes, and we're duplicating the work that you see here. It's generally known that co-cultures actually help the whole picture. So our plan is to actually extend the co-culturing to see what the optimal things are and actually develop a biliary system, a true biliary system. So that's work yet to be done, but these are what we've done so far. Yes?
Follow-up to that, is your blood in the animal model where you showed it implanted, do you give any anticoagulants to that or the ex vivo?
Yeah, no.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes.
It's hard for people in the back.
So the question is, do we anticoagulate the animals? And the answer is yes. So these animals that we've done so far do not have an endothelial lining. The structures are made of PDMS, and we do heparinize the system. And we've gotten flow to 10 days. That's the best we've done so far.
Must be other questions out there.
It's rare that we get the opportunity to hear a speaker who could show us the science and also show us how the science is helping people's lives. mentioned that as a surgeon, your motivation was the clinical successes that you have. But for those of us who are more of a basic research lab, fairly removed from the clinical setting, a lot of our driving forces are more publications, high-impact publications, stuff like that. I was wondering if you had any comments on how those two motivations, do you think they're synergistic? Do you think they sometimes conflict with each other? Are they compatible?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think the short answer to your question is any of those scenarios can play out. And it completely depends on the individual, who the individual works with, what motivates and drives them, and the setting they're in. So I would say in a collaborative setting, all the good things can happen. But whether or not you're, 80% of your activity or 100% of your activity is in the laboratory, I think that the ultimate driver for these sorts of technologies is not the high-impact journal. That's the root. But again, it's patient benefit in the end. So I think these kinds of things are basic in their engineering, but then they are intended to be translational and to get back into therapies. Yes?
I'm an oncologic surgeon, and many of our patients die from hepatic failure. They're not candidates for liver transplant because there's tumor elsewhere. Our experience with hepatic artery perfusion has been very bad. Have you given any thought to these hepatic cell impregnations, perhaps with something in them to be anti-neoplastic? Could that be the next cutting edge in oncology?
Yes. So the question is, terrible problem, cancer, liver failure, is there any way that these could be adapted in that circumstance? And I think the answer is yes. And I think this field of regenerative medicine has already had an impact on the cancer field because stem cells, which were not understood 10 years ago and now are more understood, there are now theories that certain forms of cancer or all cancer may start from clonal proliferation of stem cell populations. So there's an immediate application, but then to have a liver assist device or another way to deliver more effective agents or repopulate the liver, I think all of those technologies are potential improvements in the way we take care of cancer patients. And I think, again, the tools of how to deliver things locally and in high concentrations and many other ways to think about things could come out of an institute like this.
Can you describe the failure associated with this PDMS three-dimensional artery?
Yeah, two phrases. Dead animal, dead graft. So the implants are just beginning, and it's after all the bioreactor work that we've done so far. But if you implant these things and close the incision, there's really not a good way to assay it day to day. So what we have to do is pick days. We actually put the animal to sleep, open it up, take a look, and see if there's blood flow. So we've gotten fall off, but the longest is 10 days. So if we come in the morning and the animal's dead in the cage, then you can be sure the graft is dead and it's clotted. But you can have a well is strong, but you can have an animal that's still alive and you open them up and the graft is dead and the blood vessels are clotted. So we really haven't sorted out yet what there are probably 1,000 variables that need to be sifted through. But that's sort of the empiric observation that we have so far. Dead animal, dead graft, clotted vessels.
David, I think you had your hand up.
Some people almost define tissue engineering as biodegradable scaffolds with cells grown on top of it, but as you're showing some of the hepatic organ constructs, it's actually using probably non-biodegradable polymers or other types of scaffolds. Do you think one should concentrate only on PGA as the scaffold, or are there other types of non-biodegradable things?
Yeah. So the question is, how broad is the definition of the field? I think it at least conceptually, the way I think of it is, how broad are all the technologies that could be brought to bear to help the patients. And I think it's much, much broader than that strict definition. So I have slides which I did not bring that really